Aristotle's account of arete, so of excellence, leads to a very specific claim. He tells us that excellence is an activity and not a possession. It is built through habituation. It is stabilized as disposition. It is guided by practical judgment, and it is made real only in the sustained exercise of our capacities across various situations in our lives. And this means that arete is never finished. There is no point at which the work of being excellent is done and we get to just keep what we have built. But all of this leaves something unanswered, because if excellence is this ongoing activity, and if it is something we're always in the process of doing, then the natural question to all of this is, what is all of this actually oriented toward? What is the larger goal that all of this effort and craft ultimately is in service of? Because effort without a concrete direction is just mindless exertion. And Aristotle certainly isn't describing exertion. What he is actually doing is describing a life that goes well in a very specific and very demanding way. So the more accurate question we have to ask ourselves is, what does it actually mean for a life to go well? And not just for a day or a year, but for a life taken as a whole. And his answer to that question is eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia usually gets translated as happiness or sometimes flourishing. And this translation is understandable, but it can sometimes mislead us. Because with eudaimonia, Aristotle doesn't just mean a feeling or some state. He doesn't mean something that comes and goes depending on how our day or how our week is going. What he actually means is something that is much more concrete. Eudaimonia, in his account, is a predicate of a whole life. It is the kind of thing that can only genuinely be said of a life that is taken together, a life that is seen from the beginning to the end and assessed as a complete thing. So eudaimonia doesn't really belong to any particular moment within a life. It belongs to the life as a whole. Now there's a story Aristotle brings in from Herodotus in book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics that helps explain this a bit more concrete. So the story goes like this. Croesus, so the king of Lydia, is a legendarily wealthy man. So one day he asked Solon, an Athenian lawgiver, to name the happiest man alive. And Croesus fully expected to hear his own name, right? But Solon refused. Instead of Croesus, Solon named Tellus, who is an Athenian citizen who had lived well, who had served his city, who has seen his children prosper, and who then died honorably in battle. And when Croesus pressed on him to explain himself, Solon said something that Aristotle takes very seriously, which is that we should call no man happy until he is dead. Now the point here isn't that death is the ultimate reward of life. The point is that whether a life went well can only be judged once it is fully complete. And this is because, while someone is still living, fortune can still intervene. In other words, before death, the story of a life isn't finished, which means that the verdict can't yet be given. Now, Aristotle doesn't really adopt Solon's position entirely. He thinks Solon goes slightly too far, and will come back to where and or how and why. But the underlying principle Aristotle does accept, which is that eudaimonia belongs to a complete life. And this is really what separates it from anything we'd normally call quote-unquote happiness. Because happiness, in the way we tend to use it, is episodic. It comes and goes with circumstances, with how our day goes, or how our week or month or even a year happens to go. But eudaimonia is something entirely different. Eudaimonia is the overall character of a life that has been lived in a certain way, and lived from start to finish. And that, as you can imagine, is a much harder thing to achieve, and also a much harder thing to judge than any feeling we might have about how things are progressing or going in the exact moment. And in regard to eudaimonia, Aristotle is also very precise about what he actually means. He says in book 1 that eudaimonia is the activity of the soul in accordance with the best and most complete excellence in a complete life. Activity, because it is something we do and not something we have. Soul, because it concerns the full exercise of our faculties, not just material comfort or physical well-being. The best and most complete excellence, because partial excellence isn't enough, because a life that develops only some of its capacities well and neglects the rest, this life falls short. And finally, in a complete life, because a single act of virtue, or even a sustained period of excellent activity, this doesn't add up to eudaimonia if the life as a whole doesn't sustain it. Now, among all of the things we tend to pursue in our own lives, Aristotle argues that eudaimonia occupies a very unique position. And this uniqueness comes down to two properties or characteristics. Namely, that eudaimonia is both the final end and it is a self-sufficient end. We can think about it this way. Most of the things we tend to pursue, we pursue at least partly for the sake of something that is beyond what we are pursuing. We pursue honor because we believe that it reflects something real about who we are and what we have done with ourselves. And we pursue pleasure because it makes the experience of living or being alive actually feel good. We pursue wealth because of what wealth makes possible. Even virtue, Aristotle says, even excellence of character, we choose at least partly because we believe it contributes to living a good life. So, in every one of these cases just mentioned, there is a reference beyond the thing that is actually being pursued. There's essentially always an answer to the question, and what is this for? That points to somewhere further along. But eudaimonia is where this chain stops. We never pursue eudaimonia for the sake of something else. Nobody says, I want to flourish in life or live a good life so that I can do this other thing. According to Aristotle, eudaimonia is always the final goal or the final end. Everything else we pursue in life, we pursue at least in part, because we think it brings us closer to it. And that's what he means by calling eudaimonia the most final and the most complete end. It is the end that isn't instrumental to anything further. And that makes eudaimonia fundamentally different in kind from every other good we can name, because every other good is, in some sense, always in service of something that is beyond itself. The second property of eudaimonia is self-sufficiency. And here, Aristotle is very careful because he doesn't mean that the person who has eudaimonia can just live alone and needs nothing and no one else. He says explicitly that self-sufficiency here doesn't mean living alone, since we are by nature creatures who live among other people. We are creatures who live in families and in cities and in communities. So what he actually means here is that when eudaimonia is genuinely present in a life, it can't be made better simply by adding something else to it. If you could take a life and add some further good and make it more choice-worthy than it already was, then what you had before simply wasn't yet eudaimonia. Because eudaimonia, by definition, is already the most choice-worthy thing. And you can't just improve on it by supplementing it. So if eudaimonia is the most final end, and if it is self-sufficient, then it can't be one good that is just sitting alongside other goods on a proverbial list. Think about what that would mean. If eudaimonia were just another goal or item on a list, if it were just another thing in a catalog of goods a life could attain, then you could always add something to it. You could simply take eudaimonia and add pleasure or add honor, and the combination would be more choice-worthy than eudaimonia alone. But Aristotle has just told us that that isn't possible. Eudaimonia can't be improved by addition. So it can't be one good among many other goods, no matter how excellent those goods are. And what this means is that eudaimonia has to be something that is different in kind. Eudaimonia isn't the best thing in the catalog of goods. It can't be. It doesn't even belong to the catalog in the first place. What it actually is the condition in which the things stand in the right relation to one another. Honor, pleasure, virtue, friendship, the exercise of our intellectual or practical capacities, and material sufficiency All of these things are goods, and Aristotle never says otherwise, but none of them alone, and no random combination of them, adds up to eudaimonia. What makes a life eudaimon is that all of these things, they have to be present, and they also have to be ordered in such a way that actually expresses the full exercise of our excellences across our own lives. The goods themselves, they have to be there, but they also have to be held together by something, and that something is the activity of the soul living well. Eudaimonia is essentially what we get when nothing essential is missing in our lives and when nothing present is out of proportion. But if that's what eudaimonia actually requires, then we have a problem, because not all of these conditions are really up to us. Someone can have genuine excellence of character and still lack the circumstances, the outside circumstances, material circumstances, in which that excellence can fully express itself. On the other hand, someone can have all of the comfort and material ease one can wish for without any of the depth that would make that a life that is actually worth living. Each of these is a life with something that is real in it, but each still falls short. And the reason it falls short isn't always a failure of character. Sometimes it is just that the outside conditions that facilitate eudaimonia just aren't available. Now, Aristotle could have made his argument about the good life a lot cleaner by just saying that virtue alone is sufficient for eudaimonia, no matter the outside circumstances. The Stoics actually came close to exactly this position after him, and there's something very appealing about it, because it puts the whole thing within our individual control. But Aristotle refuses this, and he refuses this because he thinks it doesn't really match what we actually know about human life. In Book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics, he says plainly that eudaimonia also requires external goods, and the list he gives is specific. We need friendship, we need some degree of material provision, we need civic conditions that actually allow for the excellence of virtue. And we even need things like not having our children come to total ruin. These aren't luxuries that get added on top of an already complete inner life. These are actually conditions without which eudaimonia simply isn't possible. A person who is genuinely excellent in character, but who has lost everything, whose city has been destroyed, whose family has been taken away from them, Aristotle wouldn't call this person having a life that is eudaimon. No matter how admirable the person's inner formation is, the outside conditions simply weren't there for that to become what it could have been. And this is where Priam comes in. Priam was the king of Troy, and for most of his life he had everything that should have made his life eudaimon. He ruled a wealthy and powerful city. He had 50 sons. His family was large and thriving, and his standing among men was secure. But then a war came to his gates that he didn't start and couldn't prevent, since it was literally set in motion by the gods themselves. It was set in motion by forces that had nothing to do with his character or his choices. And over the course of that war, he watched everything he once cherished come apart. He watched his sons die, one after another. He watched Hector, the best of them, dragged behind Achilles' chariot around the walls of the city Hector had given his life to defend. There's even a moment in Book 24 of the Iliad where Priam, who is now an old man, has to go alone into the enemy camp at night to kneel before the man who killed his son and beg for his body back. And when Troy finally got conquered, Priam himself was killed at the altar of his own palace. In the ruins of the world he'd spent his whole life building. Now, the thing that matters about Priam for Aristotle's argument is that none of this was Priam's fault. His character didn't fail him, his judgment didn't fail him. The gods just decided that it was his time, and the world just came down on him. And no amount of personal excellence or the perfect character could have prevented this. And Aristotle wouldn't call Priam's life eudaimon despite everything it contained before the fall, because even a life of genuine excellence that is lived well for decades can still be overwhelmed by misfortune so severe that eudaimonia becomes literally impossible. And Aristotle doesn't try to soften this. He doesn't try to explain it all the way and tell you that everything is going to be all right. Instead, he lets it stand as a real limitation on what virtue alone can guarantee. But he also doesn't let fortune have the final word. Yes, external conditions, they matter. Yes, severe misfortune can prevent eudaimonia from being fully realized. But the person of genuine excellence still bears misfortune differently from the person who doesn't have that formation. He says in Book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics that the truly good and the truly wise person bears all the chances of life with dignity and always does the finest thing that his individual circumstances allow. So excellence doesn't just vanish when the conditions of our lives turn hostile. It actually expresses itself precisely in how that difficulty is met. And the quality of that response is itself a real form of arete, even when the full conditions for flourishing in life aren't there anymore. So, what we are essentially left with here is a concept that refuses both extremes. On the one hand, there is the fantasy that inner virtue or the perfect character makes us invulnerable to the world, that the formed soul is untouchable regardless of what happens around it. Aristotle doesn't believe in this, and he thinks that by pretending that it is true, we are actually not really taking seriously what human life is actually like. And on the other hand, there is the conclusion that fortune will and can determine everything, and that character is irrelevant in the face of enough misfortune. Aristotle doesn't believe in that either, because character is exactly what determines how we respond to whatever fortune throws at us. And that response itself is meaningful. It is meaningful even when the circumstances themselves are terrible. And this is also where he comes back to Solon. Remember Solon's claim in the beginning. Solon's claim was that we should call no one happy until they are dead, because fortune can always intervene while a life is still going on. Now, Aristotle accepts the concern behind the idea, but he also thinks that a well-formed character has a kind of stability to it that fortune alone can only damage but not easily destroy. In his mind, a character that is built through a lot of habituation, refined through practical wisdom, and sustained against real situations in life, this kind of character, it doesn't just collapse when life gets hard. Instead, this kind of character endures, and it continues to express itself even in bad situations. And this expression still counts for something, even if it doesn't constitute eudaimonia in the fullest sense of what Aristotle actually describes. In other words, Aristotle's eudaimonia is honest in a way that more idealized concepts simply aren't. It admits that the best thing in human life is genuinely exposed to conditions that aren't fully in our control, and it also admits that excellence alone doesn't guarantee everything. But it also insists that excellence is the center of gravity, that it is the thing that holds life together even when the external conditions are working tirelessly against it. So eudaimonia can't be fully guaranteed, and it also depends on more than just our own character. But that doesn't make the concept passive. Eudaimonia doesn't just sit there as a description of how things could have turned out in life. On the contrary, eudaimonia organizes life. And in order to understand what that means, we need to go back to something that Aristotle said early in his book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics about how different arts and disciplines relate to one another. And the argument goes something like this. Some arts and some disciplines govern others. The art of bridle making serves horsemanship. Horsemanship serves the art of war. And the art of war serves the broader aims of the political community. In each case, the higher art determines the purpose and also the limits of the lower one. It doesn't replace the skill that is involved in the subordinate art, but it does tell that art what it is actually for and where it fits into the larger picture. And the art that governs all of the other arts, so what Aristotle calls the master art or the architectonic science, this is politics. Now, by politics, Aristotle doesn't mean what we mean by the word politics today, so the contest for power or the machinery of government. What he means is actually something that sits closer to the art of ordering the communal life well. So the discipline that dictates how we human beings should live together and what actually makes flourishing possible in the first place. It is politics in this sense that determines which disciplines are actually pursued in a city and to what extent. And the highest good, so the end that this ruling art, so politics, ultimately aims at, according to Aristotle, is eudaimonia. And the logic of this doesn't only apply at the civic level, it also works within our individual lives in the same way. Because eudaimonia, if it really is the most complete and most final end, has to function as the end in light of which every other end in life finds its proper place. Training, work, friendship, the pursuit of knowledge, the enjoyment of pleasure, or just simply the accumulation of material possessions. These things, they aren't simply good or bad in the abstract. Their place depends entirely on how they are ordered. Because when a subordinate good is pursued as if it were the ultimate good, it tends to grow beyond its proper limit. Training, for example, becomes obsessive when it has no sense of what the physical capacity is actually for. Wealth can become an end in itself when there is nothing it is meant to serve. And even the pursuit of honor can consume a person when it isn't governed by something that is beyond itself. So what eudaimonia provides, and what it actually does within the structure of a life, is to set the proportions. Eudaimonia is the end that tells every other pursuit or every other goal how much of itself is appropriate and when it has done enough. And this also means that eudaimonia isn't just the last item in a sequence of goods. We can't collect the other goods one by one and then arrive at flourishing as some kind of final addition or destination. Eudaimonia is closer to the thing that holds everything together. It is what determines how the parts of a life relate to one another. A life can contain honor, pleasure, virtue, friendship, material sufficiency, and still not be eudaimon if those things exist in the wrong proportions, or if they are just simply pursued without any coherent sense of what they are actually contributing to. And equally, a life can also be genuinely eudaimon even when some of these goods are present only modestly. And with this, we can see what eudaimonia actually demands of the person who takes the concept seriously. Because, think about it, if eudaimonia is what sets the proportions, then living well will, per definition, require a constant act of judgment about how or where those proportions currently stand. It requires asking ourselves at every significant juncture of life whether the effort being given to one part of life is actually still serving the whole, or whether it has started to overextend itself. And that question never has a permanent answer. The proportions themselves will change as circumstances change. It'll change as we age, and as the people around us change, and as the conditions around us also change. So those that are oriented toward eudaimonia aren't those who have somehow worked out the correct arrangement once, and now just simply try to maintain it. They are actually those who are continuously analyzing the situation or their life and adjusting, because life itself is constantly changing and it is constantly being adjusted. Ultimately, this connects back to everything Aristotle has built across his ethics. Arete is the excellence that allows us to respond well. Phronesis is the practical wisdom that lets us perceive what each situation actually calls for. Hexis is the stable disposition that keeps us oriented in the right direction, even when the circumstances or the particulars are changing. And eudaimonia is the end that all of these capacities are ultimately in service of. Eudaimonia is the reason they matter. Without it, as the organizing principle, excellence simply becomes exertion for its own sake, and practical wisdom will have nothing to govern its judgments against. But with eudaimonia, every capacity we develop in our lives can find its place within something that is larger. And the life that results from all of this is not a life that has been solved or completed. It is a life that has been lived well, in full awareness that living well is an activity that continues for as long as we live, and that its quality at any given moment depends on the same thing as it has always depended on, which is whether the person at the center of all of it has the judgment and the character to meet what comes next.